research project titled Domestic Work, Law, Economy, and See Women's Work, Knowledge Production at the ILO Domestic Workers Convention in the Global Migration Governance. Liberty is going to tell you more about our project in a minute, so I'm not going to take much time. My job today is to welcome everybody and give you a bit the aim of the discussion today, that, as you already know from the poster, the advertisement that you got, is a really open discussion with some very distinguished speakers, people who have been working really directly on the topic of how domestic workers issues, domestic workers' rights, that, as you know, is a field that has been unacknowledged for many years, what has meant to make this topic become a matter of policy making, of international policy making. So what is the meaning of everything that happened around the international struggle for domestic workers' rights? And we have here people that have been protagonists in that process. So I'm going to introduce everybody. And then after a round of interventions, first Liberty presenting the preliminary results of a project, then we open up to the discussion with the 4 invited speakers, and after that we have a Q&A session when you can make questions to all the speakers, and also, of course, you're very welcome to bring your own perspective and experience. So let me first of all introduce Liberty. Liberty, as I mentioned before, is a Marie Curie fellow working under I'm lucky enough to have Liberty working under my supervision, I would say. Before starting to work at Ca' Foscari, she has been a lecturer and a postdoctoral researcher in various universities in the Netherlands, where she is currently based at Amsterdam and Groningen. She has a PhD from the National University of Singapore, and before that she has a master in Australia and a BA from the Philippines, which is her home country. I also want to mention that Liberty has been working on a manuscript of a book that is about to come out with Springer, and the book will be entitled Merchants of Migrant Domestic Labor, Recruitment Agencies in Southeast Asian Neoliberal Migration Governance. That this book is mainly based on the previous research that Liberty has carried out, as you understand very well from the title, in the field of what is the function, what has been the role of agencies in the recruitment of domestic workers, especially in Southeast Asia. So this meeting today has to do with a current project that she's about to finish, and so I'm also very happy to see all of you around, in also, let's say, celebrating the end of this project and hearing the first results that she's going to disseminate in the coming future. So let me introduce the other speakers of today. We are going to have Fish EP, that, as many of you know, she's the coordinator of the Asian Pacific branch of the International Domestic Workers Federation. I'm happy to see Fish again. We met in Venice some years ago, and she has a hello. I changed my hair color in the meantime, but I'm still myself. Fish has a labor union background, but she has also, as you know, a very extensive experience in transnational organizing, also in research and building movements. She's a board member of the Asian Migrant Center and of the Asian Migrants Credit Union. Today she will bring her experience in navigating complex and diverse ethnic contexts in the Asian and beyond in the global care chain. We have then Vicky Kanyoka. She was also in Venice some years ago, and she's the regional coordinator for Africa at the IDWF. She was until last year, 2023. She has been the person in charge for the programming activities, the training, networking with partners, and facilitating the growth of trade unions for domestic workers in Africa. Now, since August, she's the Assistant General Secretary of the IDWF, And this new role means that she will help implement new plans and decisions that have been approved by the Congress and the Executive Committee. So she has a very insider perspective on what is the function of what has been the function of IDWF in this scenario. I will move then to Ida LeBlanc. She's the General Secretary of the National Union of Domestic Employees and Executive Committee member of the EDWS for the Caribbean. She's also a member of the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Network in New York. She was also part of the team that fought and won for the C-189 and the accompanied recommendations for domestic workers. So she's fighting in particular from the standpoint of the rights of domestic workers in Trinidad and Tobago, asking the government to ratify the convention there. And Grace Papa is instead the political secretary of EFAT in Europe for the domestic work sector, for gender equality and for diversity. She also serves as the regional coordinator for Europe for International Domestic Workers Federation again. She has been the regional secretary of the Belgian trade union ACVECSC, I don't know if I pronounce it well, for food and services, in charge for domestic workers issues. And she has been member of the executive committee of the International Domestic Workers Federation for 6 years already. So I'm thanking all these speakers for being here today, finding the time and the energy of connecting from different parts of the world. And I leave the floor to Liberty for a short talk on the preliminary results of our ongoing project. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sabrina. So I have a PowerPoint prepared. So I will quickly share my screen with you. I think you should be able to see me and the PowerPoint presentation as well. So can I get confirmation that the PowerPoint is visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so thanks everybody for making time today. I'm not gonna, this is a very short presentation, just so I think help contextualize the conversations that we will be having during the roundtable discussion. This project in the last 2 years has really been motivated by some questions, right, for me as a researcher, and conversations about the relationship of knowing and acting, really. And so this project has been motivated by questions in feminist science studies that really kind of looks at the relationship of a few different things. So knowing and acting, and trying to understand this process of producing knowledge about the world, in this context, domestic work and the ILO. And to understand that it's not a simple process of discovery, quote unquote, right? So, the past couple of years has really kind of highlighted the importance, for example, of the relationship between values and facts, which in the philosophy of sciences tend to be seen as two very distinct things. And I think in this research, it's become quite clear that values can often not only drive collective action, right? But values can in fact generate a demand for facts, for new facts. And I think the women's labor movements concretely demonstrate this very clear dynamic, right? Where there is a call for collective action, even if there are no clear answers yet. So I'm going to proceed with two main points. Of course, this project is quite big, but I want to just point out two things that I think might be of interest to this group and has also been kind of surprising to me. And one of them really is that in the context of the International Labor Organization, throughout its history, it's been around for over 100 years, that domestic work, the domestic sector, domestic services has always been in the discussions in the ILO, and there have been repeated attempts, four major attempts in the 30s, 40s, 60s, and more recently, to try to create a a labor standard. It has also shown, the archives of the ILO has also shown that it's always been a major sector that employs a great number of mostly women. And as you can see here on the screen, for example, these are just some of the numbers from a meeting of experts that was convened in the ILC of 1951. And perhaps the most interesting and kind of depressing has been how the descriptions about the sector from, let's say, the 1930s until today, in recent times, how the sector has been described has been very similar, right? So it is a low paid, low status sector that is very precarious, where it's liable for exploitation. Even the role of recruitment agencies in the 1930s and the 1940s, in the earliest publications, show that they also have a really interesting role even back then. So I think it just kind of highlights how it's very difficult actually to create long-lasting change when it comes to this sector. And the reason behind that, of course, is not something I would want to speculate about, but this is something that really kind of surprised me. The second point that I want to make is that the rallying cry in the run-up to the convention that domestic work is work like any other has actually a long history, and you could say that it can be traced back to the UN Women's Conferences in from the 1970s until the 1990s, right? Where the call for valorizing, for valuing, recognizing domestic work also kind of expressed itself in the calls for the creation of statistics to literally count, right? To literally be able to count the contribution of this kind of labor to societies and the economy. So this is kind of the legacy, right, of the women's labor movements in that period that continues until today, right? And it's still very much alive in the ILO, now that they're kind of developing these measurement methodologies that would try to capture what is meant by the care economy, for example. I also want to make a point about the ILO in itself, which I think is a really important international organization in the United Nations system. It is very different from the other international organizations. And of course, its tripartite structure makes it a bit more open, let's say, to the demands of labor movements, clearly, but also specifically women's labor movements. And that has always been the case, in part because there's always been a women's bureau in the ILO, right? Historically, they have a dedicated office that kind of looks into women's questions, quote unquote. And I think it's very important to really kind of highlight, right, the importance of this space that is open to women's labor movements that may not be as evident in the other international organizations in the UN system. I just want to end with this last slide, which might not be super interesting to some of you, but for this research, I think it's really interesting. You can see here in this table, the little box here that says households with the red circle. This category as a production unit type that tries to measure, right, the economy did not used to exist, right? And it now exists in the attempts to generate labor force statistics, in part because of women's labor movements and certainly the domestic worker movement. And so this is kind of, I think, a very concrete demonstration of the relationship between science, quote unquote, and certainly economics, and labor movements, right, which might not be foreseen, which might not be the intention, let's say, of advocates, but is nevertheless an effect. So I think I will stop here, and I will stop this PowerPoint. Yes, so I guess we can slowly then transition towards the roundtable discussion. And if you have any questions for me about this presentation, then we can please save it and we can discuss it in the Q&A section. So for the next hour, we will kind of look at our speakers, invited speakers today. I think we can start maybe with the legacies, right? The legacies of the International Domestic Workers Federation and really the movement, right? So maybe I can ask any one of the panelists to respond to or address what you think has been accomplished by the movement broadly and the organization specifically, let's say in the last 13 years since the creation of the C-189. Who would like to start? Don't be shy.
Hi, everybody. I am not gonna start. I'm gonna suggest my colleagues Fish or Vicky that were there since the very beginning to shed some light on that. Colleagues.
Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, my voice is not so, I'm not so well, but I'll try my best to speak up. Yeah. That is a very good question to us as the global movement for domestic workers. There are a lot of, or few things which we can be proud of since the adoption of Convention 189 in 2011. And first of all, we must be very proud as IDWF to have a global federation for domestic workers. It's a labor movement which has been covering all the regions. And if I can add, we've extended to have the MENA region where we have members. That's one thing which we are proud of, that for 13 years, we've been able to come up with a big movement, a labor movement for domestic workers, which is mainly led by women. We have a constitution, we have leadership in place. And another thing which we can be proud of is we have representative from all the regions who are in the executive committee. And that has made us, what does it mean by having representative? That all the issues of domestic workers from the regions are being brought in for discussion. And if I can say, we had, as a labor movement, we've been going in a very smooth way, such that we have been having, the last one, we have been having like 4 congresses. Last year, in 2023, we had the 4th Congress, face-to-face Congress, which was done in Dehan, whereby domestic workers are brought together to discuss their issues and to have decisions on their own issues. And that, for me, I think is a very, very important area whereby the democratic process is being done within the movement. Domestic workers are able to approve their constitution, to bring issues or to amend their constitution. Domestic workers are able to approve the resolutions. Domestic workers are able to approve their strategic plan. Now, these are some of the issues which have not happened before. But the visibility also of the domestic workers movement in the world. If you looking back on what you have presented, yes, domestic workers have been prepared, there have been some struggle. There have been some struggle for a very long time. But now you can see that domestic workers are able to speak in different space, like even at the ILO. Like recently, the domestic workers were represented at the discussion on decent work and care economy, things which were not happening before. Now, these have been some of the successful stories, but also there have been development of leadership. When you go around our regions, you can see the development of leaders from the grassroots level up to the executive committee members. They have come from the grassroots, building their unions, then through the democratic process, contesting in different positions, and now they are deciding. And this is one of the victories, when you can see the gradually ladder or the gradually climbing of domestic workers in leadership. And if I can link even with the migration in the country of destination, domestic workers were not visible. But now you can see domestic workers are in the decision-making bodies. Yeah. But also there are some other issues which domestic workers were very much excluded from the laws. But now you can see ratification of Convention 189. Like now you can see one of the leading region is Latin America, where you can see a number of domestic workers conventions, a number of convention countries have ratified Convention 189, plus other countries like Europe, the Caribbean, but also followed by Africa and Asia. This is, of course, Asia is the least, but at least you can see the effort. But there are some policies which have been changing. When you ask a domestic worker, what would you like to see? She would like to see the changes of her life, that she can have a bread, she can have a shelter, she can send the children to school. Therefore, you can see some of the progress which has been happening in the countries, like domestic workers can negotiate. They are able to negotiate for the employment contract. They are able to negotiate to have some policies like social protection, social security in their countries. They are able to the freedom of association. They are able to form the unions. It was very difficult, but now they can form the unions. They are being integrated in the trade union movement. They can speak up. Now, these are some of the issues which we can say we have seen for all these years since the start of our International Domestic Workers Federation. Maybe I'll leave few to Fish who can add on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fish, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
For me, whatever union organizing advocacy, Vicky is talking about the institutionalization of our movement and organizing building. But the first and foremost and the fundamental is how are the domestic workers, their situations. And what I will see, the biggest accomplishment is the confidence of the domestic workers can be loud and proud to say that we are workers. Our work is work, and there should be domestic work. There should be labor law recognizing us as workers. Yeah. In short, I will just say this is really the biggest accomplishment, and the domestic workers are organizing and mobilizing around the world on the International Domestic Workers Day, June 16. Thank you very much.
Does anyone else want to add to this? Otherwise, maybe as a follow-up question, then what are the new challenges of 2024 that were not present, let's say, in the past or in the recent years? I mean, what is different and new? What kind of new contexts does the organization and your individual organizations kind of need to maneuver around in 2024?
Maybe I can jump in.
Yep, go ahead, Grace.
Yeah, I think for my region, I would say I am the coordinator in Europe. And for my region, first of all, we have now, like as a federation, demonstrated that domestic work is work. We have together making the adoption of an ILO convention possible. And some countries have ratified it, but there is still more work to do. I would say that the biggest challenge is the implementation of the ILO convention. Some countries, and I'm going to speak from my region, they have ratified it, but none of them has fully implemented the convention. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge for Europe. And the second challenge is to understand that we are not a network of nice ladies coming together and demanding things, but to grow to a legitimate, recognized federation of unions that are recognized as stakeholders in negotiation, in advocacy. This is something we have to grow and continue to accompany our members into training, training, but also developing strategies. We have very good strategies, but to also make sure that everybody's in and that everybody's following the right direction. Now we have great structures, we have great demands, and we have priorities. And what we still need to work on, I think, is to bring everybody together and to make sure that everybody has the training that is necessary and the accompaniment that is necessary in order to move forward. It's a very young federation, and we have accomplished so much. it's really, really big. I mean, it's what we have been able to do is remarkable, but we need to do more, and that's what we are trying to do in the regions.
Thanks, Grace. Does anyone else want to jump in? What are the new
Yes,
challenges?
hello.
Yes,
I just
go ahead,
want to
Ida.
mention, sorry. I just want to mention the biggest challenge for us here in Trinidad and Tobago is the influx of migrant workers from Venezuela. And so there is a big barrier when it comes to Spanish and English, the language, a big barrier with language. So we are unable to really assist these domestic workers. And how we go forward with something like that, we need to really strategize with our International Domestic Workers Federation on how we can do so. Because my biggest problem with the domestic workers coming into this country is that the Prime Minister has said that domestic workers must not pay national insurance. The employer must not pay national insurance for the domestic workers. And that is a big concern for us in the National Union of Domestic Employees, because when a domestic worker gets sick, she don't have no right to the benefits under the national insurance. When she gets pregnant, she wouldn't get any right, because the national insurance in our country have over 13 benefits that workers can enjoy. And the domestic workers who are migrant domestic workers cannot enjoy those benefits like all other workers. Now, the domestic workers here in Trinidad and Tobago can enjoy it because they are covered under the national insurance because of the efforts of this National Union of Domestic Employees to include domestic workers under the national insurance. But a lot of domestic workers employers still do not pay national insurance. And that is a big concern for us because we want to see the national insurance more vibrant in terms of going out there and ensuring that employers of domestic workers really pay national insurance so that they can enjoy all the benefits under the national insurance scheme. And since 2011, when we were there in Geneva, that at that time we were a network, the International Domestic Workers Network. I was part of that. And we fought and we got the C-189. And to date, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has not ratified the Convention 185. So we continue to struggle and fight for benefits that we're not seeing happening for domestic workers. We also, in Trinidad and Tobago, we are not considered as workers under the Industrial Relations Act. Even though we have lobbied CEDAW, and CEDAW has made recommendations to our government to include domestic workers under the Industrial Relations Act so that we can enjoy the benefits like all other workers. So the domestic workers in Trinidad and Tobago, a lot of them are ashamed to say they are domestic workers, but not until all these laws are passed and domestic workers are included in these laws as all other workers, giving them equal rights in this country. Domestic workers will continue to be embarrassed to say that they are domestic workers because they do not have much to be proud of as a domestic workers. I rest my case.
Thanks, Ida. Grace, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I just want to add, because Ida said something, in my opinion, that was actually very important, is the fact that we still need to be recognized as a social partner into official schemes that exist or are supposed to exist to for social dialogue in order to really improve domestic workers' condition. For example, in Europe, it's very well structured. Every sector of activity has a recognized European social dialogue where minimum standards for the workers in each and every sector are set and then transposed in every country. One of the only sector that is not officially represented is domestic work. So what we are trying to do is to, of course, lobby to get this official platform in order to not only advocate for better rights for domestic workers, but also to make sure that all European legislation that are supposed to apply to all workers are also applying to domestic workers, which actually will eventually make sure that domestic work is considered as work and that domestic workers are considered the same way as any other workers. So I think the main challenge is, I mean, we have done a lot of work inside the federation. I think domestic workers, like Vicky said very beautifully, they have managed to organize themselves and build a international federation. I mean, like this is huge what they have been doing. Now I think the challenge is to make sure that official stakeholders are also recognizing domestic workers and including them in all the official schemes, which will make us, I mean, which will make domestic workers recognized as any other worker. And I think that's the biggest challenge. The other challenge is also the gender aspect. I think there is a lot of need for awareness raising. And I was talking yesterday in a panel with someone that said, actually, if you really, really want equality between men and women, then we need to all fight for domestic workers' rights, because eventually all domestic workers, or almost all domestic workers, are women, and all women are domestic workers, basically. So if you really want to reach equality, we need to achieve more understanding of the burden that is on every woman's shoulder when talking about the responsibility of taking care of the home, the children, the sick and the disabled, and to then recognize this type of service provided by domestic workers or women is recognizing that this is a job. And then maybe when this will be structured, we will reach equality between men and women. So I thought it was a beautiful to say every domestic worker is a woman and every woman is actually a domestic worker.
Thanks for that, Grace. Does anyone else want to respond to this question about challenges? Can I just ask a follow-up about Ida brought up the question of the challenge of migrants coming from Venezuela into Trinidad and Tobago, and how nude basically can't assist them because of the language problem. So does the IDWF kind of have specific kind of strategies to address migrant domestic workers, right, across regions, let's say? Fish, go ahead.
Yes, actually, it's very, very related to what Grace and Ida has been said about the challenges. First of all, the old challenge still carry on, meaning the non-recognition of domestic workers' work, and the domestic workers not being recognized in all the labor laws and policies, or many laws and policies. So, and at the same time, especially with the COVID And also, the more governments has austerity measures, then when the government feels, oh, we have not enough money, the first thing they will leave aside and shrink on the government budget is on the social service and the care. And that's the area that where domestic workers, along with other care workers, as well as the general workers who has care needs, are more suffering. And these are the challenges that brought from the old days, old challenges, but the challenges has become bigger. And we have seen governments talking about, oh, we have aging population. Let's bring migrant cheap labors. The emphasis for the government is on the cheapness of domestic workers from abroad to cater the care crisis. And that's a real crisis for humanity because, okay, the global north have the cheap labor from the global south. How about the global south, their own care needs? Where are the care workforce? They have all the care workforce left the country. And then, okay, the workers abroad, because the governments are leaving them aside from, first of all, freedom of association, especially in my region in Asia and also Middle East, migrants are not allowed to register a union as well as domestic workers. And that's the problem, a big problem. Because whenever you don't have a voice, you don't have representation, not to say to be included, not to say, as what Grace mentioned, being regarded as a social partner in the dialogues. And secondly, what their aims is to exclude the domestic workers in the labor laws, especially in the minimum wage protection. In recent years, especially in Asia, for example, in South Korea, the government is talking about let's copy the successes of Hong Kong and Singapore to have cheap migrant domestic workers to cope with our care crisis, the aging population, and that is what they are saying is that the migrant domestic workers and the domestic workers are to be excluded, to be fall out from the labor laws. And that will be, and domestic workers are always, in front of this situation, are always the first category of workers to be excluded from the from the labor laws. So I say this is a situation that we are facing.
Thanks, Fish. Is anyone else? Vicky, you have your hand raised? Go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, I want to echo my colleagues that one of the big challenges, which is also in the key strategic pillars of IDWF, as well as among the resolution, is about migration. Migration is one of the problems, and it scatters in both countries, from the country of origin to the country of destination. Migrant domestic workers are not protected. They are excluded from the labor law. They are not seen as workers. The freedom of association is not existing. It is very, very difficult. I can cite the example of Africa. Most of the migrant domestic workers go to work in the Gulf countries. They don't have the right to organize. The freedom of association is not there. Therefore, there's a lot. Which links also with the violence and the abuse of migrant domestic workers. Therefore, this is one of the big challenges. That's why IDWF has put it as a key area in the strategic plan, but also is one of the resolutions. But also, domestic workers, they are doing a lot of work, but you can see their skills are not recognized. That's why they are called, there are a lot of names, because they are not seen as a human being, they are not seen as workers, and they mostly are women. And when it comes to women, you can see the same mindset. because most of the policymakers are men. Therefore, you find that they are not involved in the decision-making bodies when it comes, they are not included when it comes to policymakers making. That's why there's another thing which is linked. The social protection is also an area which is one of the biggest problem for our domestic workers in the International Domestic Workers Federation. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky. Grace, did you have your hand raised?
Yes, I just want to add something to what Vicky just said that is very specific to Europe, but also maybe from other regions. I want to emphasize the challenge of the political direction the world is taking and the rise of the far right. In terms of migration, this is absolutely damaging our strategy because, of course, and I'm not going to enter into any politic point of view or whatever. I mean, in Europe, we have a very big share of migrant domestic workers, and from them also half of them are undocumented migrant domestic workers. Basically, what we are asking the governments for many years is to formalize their status of residence in Europe. And there is a lack of understanding because in Europe, there is a discussion of not letting more migrants enter Europe. What we are asking is not for the future migration policies to be adapted, but just to emphasize, to recognize and to understand that migrant domestic workers and the ones that are undocumented are living in Europe for many years already. We are not asking for more migrants, even though I'm letting that in the middle. I'm not talking. I mean, I don't have any opinion on that, but I'm just trying to say that it's becoming very, very difficult to make governments understand that for domestic workers, what we ask is to recognize that the migrant domestic workers that are actually helping every family, contributing to society, that are actually filling the care gap because the governments cannot provide care to families enough, and they absolutely know that the ones that are filling the gap of the lack of the provision that they do are domestic workers, and these are workers that are in Europe for many years, probably 10 years. And what we ask is to formalize these workers and to recognize that they are actually providing care to the family. So there is an understanding of that, there is a knowledge of that, but there is just, because of the rise of the far right, there is just we live in a moment where it's just so sensitive, the migration issue, that we cannot address the problems of domestic workers that I see separate from the whole migration discussion. And so it's a big challenge for us because it was less difficult in the past. We could have this type of discussion, and now it's like we see governments and officials just say, "Oh, this is too difficult. It's not the right timing. We just don't want to have this discussion." So that's a big challenge for us today.
Thanks, Grace.
Yeah.
Fish?
Yes, I was already so angry when I was talking about the migrant domestic workers being fallen out and excluded from everything. I forgot what we are doing. So indeed, for organizing migrant domestic workers, our key areas, I actually number one priority in Asia, because the migrant domestic workers in the destination nation is very big. I can tell you, for example, in Hong Kong, 1 out of 8 families are hiring a migrant domestic workers. In Singapore, 1 out of 6. In Taiwan, the migrant domestic workers is 1/3 of the care workforce. but they are excluded from everything. So what we are doing is really to organize the domestic workers. Of course, it's very challenging because first of all, they don't have weekly day off, and they are they are also in debt bondages because of the excessive agency fee. So while we are fighting for basic human rights, which is weekly day off, and also access to justice, for example, when domestic workers, especially migrant domestic workers, being raped and being in very dramatic cases. So we reach out the migrant domestic workers by having many migrant domestic workers leaders. So although we cannot have weekly day off on Sundays or on any day off, but we can have the organizing in the back staircase in the residential buildings, because in the building or in the neighborhood, we will have the migrant domestic workers seeing other migrant domestic workers. That's the venue of our organizing. And that's the venue speaking with the same languages of the migrants to tell the others that, you know, the situation you are facing is not right, and what the migrant domestic workers can do, what are their rights, and then we help each other. And actually, many, although we don't have freedom of association, migrant domestic workers are organized. We always start organizing by mapping out where are the groups. We always found many, and there are always migrant domestic workers who are offering themselves in their own capacity to provide help, to provide a lot of rescue. So I can say in Asia, although our migrant domestic workers groups in the destinations are still small, but it has created a big voice, because where, for example, in Malaysia, in the newspaper, you only see the news of the very horrifying cases. But now we have migrant domestic workers speaking heads. They are talking about our rights are human rights. We should be organized. Although the people around, everybody's keep on saying that they are maids and servants, but they speak out. So I say organizing is still the key, and it's always the key. Thank you.
Thanks, Fish. Maybe we can move on to, I think Fish already mentioned earlier, this question of the care economy, right? So it's in some ways actually a continuation of some of the previous debates about women's labor, right, in the ILO. And now there's conversation about, you know, a demographic crisis, aging societies, and the so-called global care crisis. Is this something that you kind of have dealt with and have spoken about within the context of the IDWF? And
May I?
yes, go ahead.
For Asia, we have done some care policy mapping. Why we are doing that? That is because we want to discuss why our situation as domestic workers are like that, because our work are not valued. And then with that care policy, we found out how the domestic workers are excluded from the social protection, meaning although we are care workers, but our care is not being taken care of. So we are not being taken care of by the government, although we are caring other families, and that's a problem for that. So this is number one. So number two is we found out that actually the government are not taking the responsibilities to take care of the people. So very, very few, I would say, most of the Asian countries do not have a care policy, meaning what we mean by that is that the government has a mandate to take care of the people, but that is not existing in the majority of Asia. So you will see if you have a child, a baby, or a child, or an elderly, you won't have any choice, but only you do it yourself, or you hire a very cheap domestic workers or a migrant domestic workers, which is promoted promoted by the government scheme to have the cheap migrant domestic workers labor force, very low paid, and even for most of the time, their money goes to the pocket of the brokers and the employment agencies. And with that care policies, mapping, and discussion, we come to other types of grassroots care workers. And then we found out that in Asia, we have a lot of other care workers called community health volunteers. They are the government-driven scheme to ask the women in the community, for example, in the mountains, in the suburbs area, to reach out to the neighborhoods to, for example, when a woman is pregnant woman is going to have labor of a baby, then they are the one to reach out to the far away neighborhood and take care of the people to provide the care. But their categorization is volunteers, not workers. So they feel, oh, they want to help the community, but at the same time, the governments keep on asking them, can you deliver this and that medicine? And then they do not have any wages. So in Philippines, they even have a Volunteers Act, putting them into the category of act and covered by the Volunteers Act. So this is an area through the care policy mapping that we have done in Asia that is an area, a potential area for our advocacy and alliance building, because these workers, no matter domestic workers and community health workers, they are all women. And what we do is care, and what the care is not valued. And it is a crucial venue for us to fight for care being valued, and also the government, the countries have to recognize their responsibility to take care of the people. Thank you.
Thanks, Fish. Grace?
Yes, I just want to mention something that is actually very basic, but unfortunately it's not really recognized yet. But in Europe, for example, government don't recognize domestic work as part of the care economy. They don't recognize that taking care of a family, a household, individuals should be included as or considered as care work. So when the European Commission 2 years ago launched its European care strategy, they pretty much talked about affordability, accessibility, and quality of care. But with regards to domestic workers, we have lobbied a lot to make sure that domestic workers are included and are concerned and are considered the same way as any other care worker. The only thing that the Commission, the European Commission, mentioned in its strategy is that they encouraged the national member states in Europe to ratify and implement ILO Convention 189. So even though there were 2 lines, and that's really only because we have lobbied so much, there is no really intention to really recognize domestic workers that are part of the care economy. And that is really something that we struggle with and that we're trying to advocate. Another thing is that the IDWF has a resolution on care as well. And one thing that I personally find really important, and I think Fish said it as well, is that care must be seen as a human right. I mean, and it's also the responsibility of governments to provide the right to self-care and the right to receive and provide care that must be done in conditions that uphold decent working conditions, so that providers and recipients of care can fully realize their rights. Yeah, I think that's basically it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, Grace just mentioned my point that care work is one of the IDWF agenda. And luckily enough, during the recent discussion, IDWF was a lead organization in the discussion on care committee. And she rightly put it, for us, care is a public good and also is a human right. And we underpin that, or we underline that domestic workers must have access to decent work and social protection for care workers. You have rightly put it that the aging is increasing, even as in Africa. You can see nowadays, the age is increasing. If I can give you an example, yesterday, my mother had a birthday, 89 years old. Even the people around were shocked because it was not used. Our life was like lifespan 65, 70, but now you can see the age is increasing. And they need care workers. Therefore, the government or the state must be responsible, And that's why, as IDWF, after the discussion, we are coming up with a program, a specific program, internally and for our affiliates to have the intensive training and awareness on care, because we see this is very important. If our members are aware, therefore they will participate very much in advocacy in their countries with their government. Because most of the government, they see that that's not their obligation. It is for private. Therefore, IDWF is taking it as a serious matter. But also, domestic workers, our unions must be represented in the decision-making, in the discussion on this agenda. It shouldn't be left, like when you talk to the unions, in most cases, it will be left to the federation. But now we see this issue of care work is a domestic workers agenda, is IDWF agenda. Therefore, our members must be very conversant on it so that they can represent well their members in the discussions, in their countries, and even at their federation. Discussion with the government. We are talking about the policies. Who are representing workers or domestic workers in decision-making bodies when it comes to policies, when it comes to social protection? Therefore, as IDWF, we need to be engaged, and we have taken this as a serious issue as we took it at the discussion, that the discussion on decent work and the care economy is a domestic workers agenda, because domestic workers are also care workers.
Thank you, Vicky. I think I'm very cognizant of the time, so maybe we can just close the RTD and give some time to for the attendees to maybe ask questions. I turn over the floor to Sabrina, please.
Yes, thank you. I would invite anyone who wants to make a question or share her experience, maybe also people involved in struggles in other parts of the world, other countries, if they want to give their insights. I'm also inviting the speakers, if you want to clarify something, just please jump in. And also questions about the presentation from Liberty at the very beginning. Please write maybe your name in the chat, or raise a hand on the screen. I think many interesting points have been raised. I see Maria Liz Baiocchi from Argentina. I would ask everybody to just say who they are and where they're based, so that people that don't know them get to know them. Thank you. Maria Liz, please. If some people that cannot speak want to write their questions in the chat, I can read them aloud for everybody. That's also a possibility.
Hi, good morning for us here in Latin America. Good afternoon and good evening for all of you. Thank you all for a really fantastic panel. I wanted to ask you, because Vicky mentioned that Latin America is a region where there has been great advancements in terms of the ratification of C-199 and changes in labor laws in regards to the regulation of domestic work. So I wanted to ask you, what best practices or lessons do you think can be learned and applied from Latin America in your work with Latin American organizers to other regions of the world where you work?
Yeah, thank you very much. Latin America has been impressed me the way they have been able to ratify Convention 189. And what I can learn is, I would like to learn the strategies which they have been able to influence the government to ratify Convention 189. It has been very difficult, like in my region. Up to now, we have 55 countries, but to date, we have only 6 countries which have ratified Convention 189, but also the implementation is not very encouraging. Therefore, we would like to know how they've been able to mobilize, organize, unified, bring solidarity together, and to make sure that the government, to influence the government to ratify Convention 189, the strategies which they've been using. With regard to implementation, yes, there's a very difficult challenge in implementation, but you can find some of the countries, like where our president comes in Uruguay, they've been able to have like social health insurance fund, social security. These are some of the good practice. Therefore, we would like to know how they are influencing the government and working as a team in the region to influence, because I've learned sometimes they have teamwork within the region to work together to influence government to ratify and implement some of the good policies for domestic workers.
Okay, thank you, Vicky. I have Fish and then Grace that want to answer.
Yes, I may not know everything, but this is what I have observed, how the Latin American been successful. First of all, of course, historically, they have struggles against the colonizer. So, and that's an inbuilt historical thing in the labor movement and the women movement. And the domestic workers are usually historically are the slaves. And that may be something that has brought people to workers to struggle. The other thing I have observed, I'm not sure if this is right or wrong, but that's what I observed, is that the domestic workers organizations in the Latin America are very often built by the rights-based from the church-based, faith-based organizations, the churches, and the women organization. I can see there is big, besides in parallel to the domestic workers movement, there is a women's movement supporting the domestic workers movement. And I can see in Asia, this is quite lacking because, first of all, the trade unions in Asia is not so supportive. I mean, it's still very largely industrial based, meaning talking about own interests, wages, etc. And still in Asia, is still maids and servants are domestic workers, what the languages among the people, including the trade union centers. And the other thing is the women's movement, they talk about unpaid care, they talk about care value, and they do time use and the movement. But I think on the domestic workers who are women and in the women's movement, we have to highlight more on the class issue among the women's among the women's movement. Same among the trade union movement is that domestic workers are workers of the workers of the workers. So what are the class issue inside the trade union movement is also has to be considered. Thank you.
Grace.
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, I won't be speaking about good practices in Latin America, but maybe from my region, I can share the good practices. We have countries where we have excellent practices. Fortunately, even though we were very negative about the challenge, it's good that, I mean, we can raise the good practices. We have countries where domestic workers are considered as any other workers. They have the exact same rights, social rights, workers' rights, everything, where they have decent working conditions, where there is a social dialogue happening, collective bargaining that are very strong, that applies to them, where they have even their when they drive from one home to another, one client to another, the travel is paid by the employer. I mean, they have breaks that they have to take, a list of authorized services to provide, a list of non-authorized services to provide. So it's very well framed and regulated. It's even financed by the government. It's subsidized. It's affordable. So it's very well framed, and everything is good. And in these countries where domestic workers are really recognized and valued and professionalized, we see three requirements reached. And the first one is political will. Political will is essential. When there is political will to recognize domestic work as work, and to really will to frame it, to regulate it, and even finance it, I think that's the first step to open doors for full recognition. The second criteria is to have strong unions. If domestic workers are building their own unions or they're part of a bigger trade union, we need strong trade unions to include domestic workers. And in Europe, it's often challenging. I have to say, there are unions for which it's very obvious domestic workers needs to integrate the union. Some other unions just don't know how to organize domestic workers. So we work with them to try to invest in new methods to organize domestic workers, and even human resources, because how you organize domestic workers is totally different than other workers in a factory, for example, where you enter a factory and you meet with the workers and then you start organizing them. So they need to invest in new methods, but they need to invest in human resources to organize domestic workers, etc., etc. So we need big trade unions, strong trade unions that are structured and organized and want to really advocate for the rights of domestic workers. And the third criteria would be social dialogue. In Europe, I mean, social dialogue, when you have a strong social dialogue with strong unions and employers that represent the employers or the agencies, and that they sit around the table and they are willing to go, to improve the sector at all levels. That's where we see that the rights of the workers are the most respected. So I would say political will, strong unions, strong social dialogue. That's for Europe.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for these three comments on the question from Alice. Is there any other issue that someone else wants to raise? Any other comment? Yeah, I see Mary
Yeah.
Goldsmith. Hello, Mary. She shared a possible answer from Marcelina Bautista from Mexico on the same issue. Thank you for that. She's saying Marcelina's comment about the lesson to be learned from Latin America. It's one, lobby with governments, and two, coalition building with other organizations and individuals, including employers, to achieve ratification of C189. Thank you.
Yes. Should I say something? I don't know how to put up my hand.
No need of it.
I've been using something to put up my hand for a long while and wasn't getting through. But I'm glad for the comment by Marcelina concerning we have to be more, we have to link with employers, in particular for me, for our organization. We will be having meetings with employers because we just celebrated 50 years of existence on Saturday. We also celebrated Clotilde Walcott Day, that was the founder of the National Union of Domestic Employees. And she died some years ago, and we celebrated her life because without her, we would not have this union existing today. Because our union started off in 1974, organizing workers on the ground, the domestic workers in particular. And in 1982, we then registered as a trade union. And in 1992, we amended our constitution to include all other workers. So sometimes you start doing a job as you might be working in a store or whatever, and you lose your work. The easiest thing for you to do now is to try to find an employer who wants a domestic worker. And even today, that is a difficult thing to do, to find a domestic worker. So we have a cooperative running now, and the cooperative coming out of the National Union of Domestic Employees, we offer services, domestic work to employers. So you can call the cooperative and get a domestic worker. And the ILO has worked with us in order to do a contract of employment. So we have a contract where the domestic worker can go to the employer and use the contract. Because normally if a domestic worker is being hired, she wouldn't go with a contract. But because she belongs to the cooperative and the National Union of Domestic Employees, we offer her a contract. You can use that to negotiate with the employer to get good terms and conditions of work, and so that you have a written contract on what the employer had promised and what you have, the work that is outlined for you to do. Now, when I was speaking before, I said that domestic workers are not covered under the IRA, the Industrial Relations Act, but I want to say that we are covered under the minimum wages order. And to some domestic workers, and with the minimum wages order, we can go to the court for violation of the minimum wages order. But we cannot go if the worker was dismissed or things like that, because a big part of this union is grievance handling and seeking compensation for workers when they are fired wrongfully. We cannot do that for the worker if it doesn't, if he is not a worker. But if he was covered under the minimum wage law and the employer had violated the law, we can go to the court and seek redress, go to the Ministry of Labor, who offer conciliation services. Now, we spoke about the domestic workers, and we spoke like if it was only women who are doing domestic work. Now, according to this convention, it says that the task of domestic workers is cleaning the house, cooking, washing, ironing clothes, taking care of children or elderly, or sick members of a family, gardening, guarding the house, driving for the family, even taking care of household pets. Now, some of these chores are done by men, but these men do not want to recognize that they are domestic workers. But we see it happening in Jamaica, you know, with the handyman around the house doing the gardening and things like that. He recognized himself as a domestic worker, but not in Trinidad. I try to convince some of them that you are a domestic worker, don't be ashamed. Himself, you're a handyman or whatever you're doing in the house. You know, you are a domestic worker, but they don't want to hear about that at all. So we have to break that barrier, this gender barrier, that men feeling that there's not a domestic worker. And I think the whole thing about it, they're ashamed to say they're a domestic worker. Now, the minimum wages law provides for salaries, sick leave, vacation leave, and we also covered under the Maternity Protection Act. So whilst government does not recognize them as workers, we were able to fight and win these laws to protect the domestic worker. So you cannot fire a domestic worker if she's pregnant. You know, we could go under the Maternity Protection Act and carry that matter to the court and seek redress in that order. So that I just wanted to say that because I don't want people to go away that it's so bad in Trinidad and Tobago. I also have to show where we fought and won things for domestic workers. Even the minimum wages law, this is something was redressed in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago, magistrate court. Now, domestic workers do not have no money to go and hire a lawyer to go there. We are industrial relations consultants. We have 2 in the union, and we are able to go to the court, the industrial court. So we have won the right to change the jurisdiction from the magistrate court to the industrial court where it pertains to the minimum wages law. So that was a big victory for us. We also have other victories for the domestic worker. For example, we have, after the Beijing conference, I must say, we have called on our government to count the unwaged work of women, because there's a lot of women home in the house and doing unwaged work, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, the elderly, and things like that. We also have a program too in Trinidad where the government, what they call the GAP program, pays the domestic worker $3,000 a month to go and care the elderly. But we even feel that money is insufficient, because when you have to pay $2,500 for a small apartment, a small house to house you and your children, you're paying that for the month. You remember $500. How could that take care of you and your children? Some people force to take husband that they don't even want because they're looking for a little help within the home. So all these is the things that the domestic workers have to face in the daily life, you know, and all these are things that we are trying to put right to help the domestic workers. But with the unwaged work, we have called on government after Beijing conference to recognize the unwaged work of women. And we were able to get, that is with Clotilde Walcott, the founder of the union, a vibrant woman, fighter for women's rights. We were able to get the Unremunerated Work Act. Now that act is just laying there in Parliament. So besides all the other work we have to do, that is one of the work that we have on our agenda for this year, to call on government. We want to know what is happening with the Unremunerated Work Act, because that is a work we are saying that women and men are performing this work in the home, because a lot of men is helping in the home now, you know. Things have been changing, you know, and all this work, and what you're getting in return. We want to see more people getting Social Security benefits, not because you're home, that don't mean you're doing nothing. you are doing work, on-wage work, and this work is contributing to the economy in every country in the world. And every March 8th, we go there with our T-shirts when we have a march, the women's movement. And that march, we say, we call it the global strike, because we are calling on women all over the country to strike on that day, don't go to work. Because I think it was Ireland or some country in Europe who strike one day to show that they're not doing no work. You see this cooking, cleaning and all that, they put it on. They're not doing that work. And the economy came to a stop. Nobody couldn't go to work on that day. And even I had a case with a domestic worker, because once you are employed by a company, because some people have companies, because we have a lot of big shots here in Trinidad and Tobago. We call them the 1%ers. 1%, but I think it's about 4% of the people in the population in the country are very rich. So that we had a case with a domestic worker there, because if you was employed by a company, then you will be recognized as a worker. But the law says anyone who works in and around the household and paid by the householder is not a worker. So we were able to go to court with her, and what the employer is saying, that the distress that she caused them, because she didn't go to work a day, and she said she didn't go to work that day because they would not pay her on time when time to get her salary. So it is difficult when you don't pay me on time, because how will I get money to go to work for the following week? You know, I had to be borrowing, and who lending any domestic worker money to go to work? Because people feel, well, domestic work is such a low wage work that they wouldn't lend you the money because they feel they wouldn't get it back. So she was not able to go to work. And he fired her for that, because he said nobody could work. The children couldn't go to school. The parents, their mother couldn't go to work, because she had to stay back now and see about the children and get them to go to work. Get the driver, because they have a driver, to carry the children to go to work. So that in itself shows you the exploitation that domestic workers have to face. And we call on government to put us in the position. We want to recognize majority status for domestic workers in Trinidad and Tobago, so that we can meet with employers and treat with employers and get rights for domestic workers, and change the laws that will really benefit the domestic workers in our country, like all other trade unions can do who have recognized majority status. And that's it.
Ida, thank you. I have a quick technical questions from Mary Goldsmith for you. She's asking, who's signing the contract in Trinidad and Tobago? Who signs the contract? The domestic worker and the employer, the domestic worker, the employer and the co-op, the employer and the co-op? Who's physically signing the contract?
But the co-op is only the domestic worker and the employer.
Okay.
And they know that is the co-op send them there, you know? So most of the time they will communicate with the co-op, you know, and they know the co-op come from the National Union of Domestic Employees. So that if anything should happen, we will be backing our domestic worker. So really we haven't reached any problem as yet with regards to payment of the domestic worker, terms and conditions of work. So that is it is very good for the domestic worker. But if you go on your own, asking for work, going with that contract, I think will make you wouldn't be able to get that work, because the employer won't trust you. They believe you come from some union back in here or whatever. Because from the time employers, whether it's your employer for domestic worker or a low-income worker, who we also represent, and you come with a contract, or you even talk about union, or the feel you're in a union, you wouldn't get any work. So that is the situation here in Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, thank you so much for this further clarification. I think everybody gave a lot of information, a lot of very precious insights and experiences and comments, and also I thank you for sharing your views, your vision for the future with us. I'm giving up back the word to Liberty, and then I'm thanking you again for being here and for those who spoke and to those who attended in the audience. Liberty.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for making time today. Of course, the panelists. I think this was really rich and there's a lot of new stuff. The work is just not going to end. So it looks like it. I had a question earlier, but I think that can be for another day. But thank you, everybody. Maybe we can just like a round of applause and I think I'm gonna stop recording now.
Thank you, Liberty, for organizing this. It was a really nice opportunity.